Good afternoon. Welcome to FAIR Studios. I'm Matthew O'Brien, the Director of Research at FAIR, and this is my colleague Joe Gomez, FAIR's Press Secretary. And today we're here to talk about the violence along the Mexican border, developments in Mexico, and the impact that it's all likely to have on immigration. I spent many years working for the Department of Homeland Security, in particular for ICE and for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and I have personal experience with the developments in Mexico. And Joe has interviewed many of the key players during his prior career as a radio talk show host and reporter. So Joe, could you start out by telling us something about the situation that's going on currently in Mexico and how things are developing?
Well, it seems, Matt, like there's a lot of violence that's been kind of targeted around some of these popular tourist destinations like Cancun and Playa del Carmen and Cozumel. These are usually places that people associate with going to the beach, relaxing, maybe having a Mai Tai, what have you. But recently, we've seen a spat of killings, particularly in Cancun, Mexico. There have been a record number of killings in Cancun so far this year. More than 100 people have been killed. On April 4th alone, 9 people were killed over a span of 36 hours. There was a total of 14 murders that happened in Cancun, Mexico. And they're all these cartel-style shootouts. And in one case, a cartel actually left a message by hanging a corpse of a 40-year-old woman, Matt, who the police apparently found badly beaten, but it was a message that basically said, "Go to blank." So, these are nasty guys, and it's unfortunate that that kind of fighting and violence is happening at some of these popular beach resorts, beach destinations, which a lot of Americans go to.
Now, to put this all in context, as I understand it, last year in Tijuana, there were about 1,700 homicides. Now, the leading city in the United States in terms of homicides in a typical yearly period usually has about 400 to 500. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's striking how much violence and how much death is happening in some of these border towns and also some of these Mexican cities. At one point, Juarez, Mexico, which is just right across from El Paso, Texas, it was called the murder capital of the world. And that's a place that I've journeyed to in my travels in Mexico and along the border as a journalist in my previous life. But they have really got just a lot of carnage that's happening down there. And it's all driven by the drug trade. Is that correct, Matt?
Yeah, that's correct. Most of the drug cartels also own the human smuggling routes and the arms trafficking routes. And so as a result of that, when you see these things happening, even if it's going on in the interior of Mexico, it has an effect on immigration because more people want to leave to escape the violence, but that also means more people have to do business with the cartels in order to get snuck over the U.S. border.
Interesting. Yeah, it's if you look around some of the areas that are close to the United States border in Mexico, those are the areas that seem to be having the biggest amount of violence, the largest amount of violence. And the question is, what happens if the violence gets so bad that people start fleeing in droves? And is that a possibility? I mean, your experience with ICE, is that something that's ever been talked about?
Well, it's a major possibility. I don't know that ICE actually has a plan in place for that. I think that there are plans for smaller mass migration events like the Haitian boat people or the Mariel boat lift. But I don't think anybody's contemplated what would actually happen if Mexico failed as a state, which is a significant possibility. And it's likely to drive large numbers of people out of Mexico if the Mexican government is no longer able to provide basic policing services and basic security for people in major cities. It's also having a huge effect on the economy because if you're in Cabo San Lucas or Cancun, you're in one of the more stable places in Mexico where a family can make a living by running a shop that sells souvenirs to tourists or running a restaurant, and all of those business activities become impossible when this level of violence is going on in the streets of Mexican cities and towns.
Yeah, I'd imagine it just probably puts things at a standstill. I remember there was a story about a town around the Texas-Mexico border where they couldn't find, it was the sheriff. They couldn't find like their version of a sheriff basically in this town because everybody kept on getting murdered that filled that position. It's hard to find some political positions where you're going to have somebody that's not going to be corrupt, I guess, in some of these communities, because of the large scale of corruption that occurs because of the drug cartels. And the State Department has issued advisories against traveling to several Mexican states right now. The same advisory, the same warning they would give to people if they were headed to Syria. And Mexico's right next door. I mean, it's remarkable.
Well, it's shocking. You're talking about our state that is a neighbor and probably the most traversed border in the world. And it doesn't seem that our neighbors to the south are able to provide the type of security and safety in their communities that they have been in the past and that we typically expect here in the United States. Now, you've actually interviewed some of the cartel members in your past career. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, there was one encounter that I'll never forget. It was when I interviewed a cartel hitman in a maximum security jail, and he was called the Littlest Zeta, and he was all tatted up all over his face, but he had started his, I guess, career, if you want to call it that, as an assassin for the Zetas, which is a paramilitary crew, as you know, and maybe our viewers might know. But he started his assassin career with the Zetas when he was about like 12 or 11 years old, and continued to work with them until they finally caught him in the U.S., and he had racked up about 20 murders he was charged with altogether in the United States. But these are some cold-blooded people. I mean, it was bizarre, his story, because he claimed that he got into being an assassin simply by his brother, I guess, cajoling him to work for the gang, and he had snuck, I guess, in a way to one of these assassin murder grounds, hit grounds, and they basically put him into the Zeta cartel after that. But he had traveled extensively around Texas. He would travel around the United States. He would go back to Mexico. And so he wouldn't just commit murders along the border. He committed murders all around the country. And I think that's something that people don't realize. The cartels have a fairly good reach into the United States.
And that's particularly scary because I think what many of our viewers don't necessarily understand is the fact that the cartels, in a number of instances, have moved in and sort of supplanted the local governments that aren't able to provide services to people, and the cartels have begun acting like city governments almost in the way that ISIS did over in Syria and Iraq, which means that rather than having a sovereign government with an interest in maintaining the border in control along the border zone, what you're seeing more frequently is battling cartels vying for control of territory almost the way that national governments would. And the Mexican state doesn't any longer appear to be in control of the border zone.
Wow. I mean, that's kind of, what you're describing is something like out of the wild, wild west, you know? It's like something, it's hard to imagine that kind of instability exists or that's actually happening, but it is, and it's happening around decent chunks of Mexico. I mean, what is going to decrease the cartel violence, do you think, if anything? Is one cartel going to have to win out against the other one?
Well, I think this is one of those situations where immigration policy and international relations and diplomacy all kind of bleed into one. And what needs to happen is Mexico needs to become more stable. And so the U.S., as part of its efforts to stabilize its immigration situation, needs to look at how do we assist a legitimate Mexican government that has the support of the people in remaining stable and in power long enough to provide Mexican citizens with the basic services that they need.
And we're taking your questions, too, on Facebook. If you have any questions, if you have questions about the cartels or the border wars that are happening along the U.S.-Mexico border between the cartels. I mean, oftentimes, what was really fascinating and striking to me recently, I found, is that the Sinaloa cartel, which is the largest cartel in Mexico, Al Chapo used to be in charge of the Sinaloa cartel, but he's obviously in jail now. But they're having, I guess, internal battles over for supremacy of this cartel. So not only are they battling other cartels like the Zetas or the Gulf Cartel, the Tijuana cartel, but they're also having inside battles too. It's like the mayhem and murder never stops.
Well, there's almost an internal administrative system to the way the business gets done between the cartels. They divide the country up into what's called plazas, which are areas where they can sell drugs. And if one cartel is going to do business in another cartel's plaza, they actually pay a tax. So the really interesting thing about this is that there's an almost governmental administrative system in place in the way these organizations do business, which has allowed them to acquire so much power over things that you don't think of criminal gangs administering. But it also means that the gangs are all fighting against each other. So there's really no possibility that one of the cartels is going to become dominant and sort of morph into a governmental / crime syndicate.
Oh, well, that's pretty fascinating. It's scary too. I mean, I've seen a lot of the violence firsthand myself, and I've talked to cartel members, former cartel members, as an investigative journalist behind bars, and also out in the field in Juarez, Mexico. And it's it is unstable, and it's only a matter of time, as you were talking about, Matt. If this violence doesn't slow down, it's only a matter of time before people just start fleeing for their lives. Because what they do to people down there in Mexico, in some of these states, like Michoacan or Tamaulipas, it's just awful. They hang people. They leave heads in suitcases as messages. They kill children. Many reports of just whole soccer fields where children are playing being, hit with errant bullets after a gun battle. So if Mexico can't get that in control, you would imagine there'd be a really big rush on the border, and all the more reason to build a wall possibly as well.
Well, and that's a good point you bring up, because we've had a question from one of the viewers. What can the U.S. do on the U.S. side of the border to deal with this issue?
Well, what they can do is limited. Obviously, Mexico is its own country. We can't just go in there and solve all their problems for them, nor would we want to. But I think that what the United States can do is start to pick up these criminal aliens who are working for the cartels, get rid of MS-13, something the Trump administration has been trying to do by increasing interior enforcement, and also have more boots on the ground, additional layers of border security, because there are vast swaths along the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona and in Texas that I've seen firsthand, where there's nothing. There's no fence. There's nothing. And so it's very easy for people to come across if they get across the river first. And oftentimes, as you very, I think, eloquently described, I guess, the machinations of these cartels, how sophisticated they are, how rich they are, they have no problem getting across the Rio Grande River.
A relatively narrow river.
Right.
It's relatively shallow and frequently easy to walk across. So we have another question from the viewers. Given that the drug dealers actually want to get their product into the United States, how likely is it that a barrier, a wall, or a fence would continue to be effective?
Well, I think that the cartels, and you could probably speak to this too, Matt, are very industrious, and they have links with other syndicated crime organizations all around the globe. And so, they could potentially find other avenues to get their drugs into the United States, fine. But if you do have a wall, or you have some kind of physical barrier where they're not just walking across, as we've seen many times, it will at least cut a significant chunk, or make it a little bit more difficult for these people to do their job, instead of just walking across with huge bags of heroin or marijuana.
Well, and I think you can supplement the wall as well. Building a wall or building a fence is not the only solution, and in and of itself, it's not going to cure the problem. What you have to do is you have to put up a barrier, but then you have to back that up with actual Border Patrol agents who are monitoring the wall, and with technological assets like sensors and drones and things like that. Because if you're doing things the way you're doing them now, you're always reacting to the problem. But if you put up a barrier and you monitor it correctly, you become proactive, because you've kept the majority of people out and you only have to respond to those who appear to be getting in. In the situation we have now, like you said, there's people swimming a river or walking across an invisible line in the sand, which means the Border Patrol is perpetually in the position of trying to find a needle in a haystack.
That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, the Border Patrol, they really have their work cut out for them. And to see the work that they do up close firsthand, it's striking how much they put their lives on the line, and their families are impacted by it. I mean, oftentimes, but there's occasion where, they will run into trouble on the border. I mean, just because they wear the suit and jacket doesn't mean that whomever's on the other side of that fence or who's on the other side of that line is going to leave them alone. And Matt, there have been occasions where members of the Border Patrol have been struck by rocks or even hit by other types of projectiles.
It's a huge problem, and many of the people who are involved in making policy decisions about this haven't taken the rock attack seriously. But there's been between 3 and 5 Border Patrol helicopters that have been downed by rock-throwing illegal aliens or drug cartel members or other people who were violating the law and crossing the border. So that's an ongoing concern. I think another concern is the fact that Mexico doesn't have a border patrol. So technically it's the Mexican Federal Police, which is a nationwide organization that's kind of like the FBI but has a uniform component, is responsible for policing the border, at least the northern border, and they're too tied up fighting the drug cartels and dealing with corruption and homicide in Mexico to pay much attention to the border. So really, it's an issue that's being monitored only from the American side of the border.
Well, I guess the bottom line is that, there are a lot of problems going on in Mexico with the violence, with the drugs, and the United States, in order to try to stem the tide of either a wave of illegal immigrants or a wave of drugs. We really need to have additional border security resources, and we need to have interior enforcement.
That's 100% correct, and hopefully we will see that, although the most recent budget bill that was passed by Congress doesn't seem to put a lot of resources into enforcement.
Yeah, it's a shame, and I really don't get a full picture of it until you see it on the ground firsthand. But thank you for joining us here on Facebook Live, and we appreciate you tuning in to this special edition of a look inside of Mexico, inside of the cartel battles. And boy, there are a lot of cartels to talk about. We can talk about this for hours, but we appreciate you folks tuning in for just this short amount of time with this Fair exclusive from Fair Studios.